Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to Give the People What They Want. We're very excited to be back on this journey with all of you, bringing you crucial news updates, stories from the movements, news you won't get anywhere else. This week, we have quite a lineup. We're going to be bringing you updates from Turkey, Argentina, the struggle there, and much, much more. So stay tuned, and this is Give the People What They Want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So last week was our first week back after a hiatus, and we had a lot of bad news to cover, unfortunately. Of course, notably the return of Donald Trump to the White House. That has changed a lot, and it's brought a lot of bad news. But this week we wanted to bring some stories that will inspire us, as always, because at Give the People What They Want, we want to tell stories of resistance and people fighting back, of which there's so much of. But before we get to some of those more concrete movement victories, perhaps a bittersweet news from France with the banning of Marine Le Pen. Roger, is this good news? Is this bad news?
It's good news and bad news. Good news that anybody who breaks the law should pay the price. She basically stole millions of euros from the people, and she spent the last few days working really, really hard to try and convince people that this is all about politics. This is all about how this poor fascist is being targeted by the judiciary. And she spent none of that particular moment in time talking about the fact that actually she stole loads of money from not just an institution, actually she stole money from the people. And we must always remember that it's the people's money, as much as this big bureaucracy of the European Parliament tries to make out that it's something else. It's actually the people's money, and she stole it and she's been done for it. But there's a difficult problem with this, is that for years, it's really been the left that's been the target of what I think we call lawfare, where the courts have kind of attacked people and tried to intervene in the political process. And we have to be really, really careful, I think, that this doesn't become part of that. I think one of the difficulties that we face is that quite often when things like this happen, is that it becomes a rallying point for people. So in this case, it could easily become a rallying point from the far right. And we're seeing this at the moment, where politicians from Hungary, from the Netherlands, from large parts of, I think even Maloney, direct descendant of Mussolini, has also commented on this, where they're all talking about this as being an attack on the far right. Actually, this is the courts doing what they're supposed to do and to find somebody guilty. But we have to be really clear that this isn't another example of lawfare, that this is actually something where somebody who's guilty is being dealt with as part of that. Now, of course, the far right, the way that they're playing this is to look at this as being, we're being done, this is an attack on us, and they're going to use this as a rallying point for them, undoubtedly. And we have to, I think, be really clear about the dangers that this poses, and not let something kind of extraneous to our organising be the kind of dominant factor in this. We have to be the ones who are saying we have to still organise against the far right. And also that this doesn't get in the way of us having to confront the far right politically, confront the far right in a contest of ideas, because easily this becomes about someone's picking on me. So I think this is a bittersweet type moment. Sweet in the sense that the far right have been done, but but also we have to be really clear as well about the bureaucracy of the European Parliament, and the fact that there's probably a whole range of political parties who are engaged in the same sorts of activities. In the European Parliament, part of the reason why people chose from Britain to withdraw from the European Union is because of that kind of bureaucracy and corruption that many people felt was part of the process. But we can't let that be the dominant kind of narrative around this. And that's where I think it gets really kind of muggy and really kind of murky. We have to be really clear about where we stand, about what we stand for, and about making sure that we stand up and say, these people who stand for the ideas of the far right are simply wrong. But this is where we stand. This is what we stand for. We're on the left, and these are our ideas about the way that society should be organised, and the way that the economy should be organised, and that people shouldn't be putting more money into warfare when they should be putting that money into welfare, which is where we kind of are at the moment, even with the social democratic kind of forces across Europe. They've fallen into that. So I think this is a murky moment, but I think we should keep our eye on the prize. Our prize is to stand up for the people, and our prize is about making sure that we stand for people who break the law should be done, but our prize is also about making sure that we stand up and organise against the far right and for progressive politics.
Yeah, it's funny how lawfare has been mostly used against the left, but somehow the left is corrupt and the right is just persecuted in their narrative. So I think, yeah, continuing to follow France. How are they going to be emboldened by this? But the people's ideas must prevail. So another flashpoint right now for the past couple of weeks has been Turkey. There's been massive protests. Thousands, I think, over 1,000 people have been detained. What's at the root of this, Prasanth?
Right, actually flows in perfectly from the previous story, because this is actually a clear instance of lawfare. Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, was arrested, accused of financial crimes and terrorism on, I believe, the 19th of March. And of course, now there are quite a few aspects to the story, but one of the key aspects is the fact that he had emerged as one of the top rivals to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the upcoming elections. Now, this election, 2028 itself, is an interesting one because Erdogan is not allowed to contest as per the rules, as per Turkey's constitution. But there is a lot of speculation that he might amend the constitution, or that he might quit before his term ends, and thus get a chance to contest again. And we have seen, of course, Donald Trump this week talking about doing something similar. A number of presidents, leaders from the far right, using these kind of tricks, and Erdogan is expected to follow that same path. And it does look like Imamoglu was the candidate who had the best chance of beating Erdogan. And in recent times, we saw both his degree, him being stripped of his degree, because apparently in Turkey, you need to have a degree to be the president. And secondly, of course, his arrest under corruption and terrorism charges. And I think even the prosecutors found the terrorism charge a bit difficult to sort of push through, so they dropped that, and now it's entirely about corruption. But the important thing, of course, is that, like you said, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets. This has become much more than the arrest of an opposition politician. This has become people coming out, even people who are not particularly supporters of Imamoglu and his CHP party are coming out on the streets in large numbers, airing their grievances against the Erdogan regime. Erdogan has been in power since, I believe, 2002, if I'm not mistaken. That's 23 years in power. Another right-wing regime following neoliberal policies, and of course, very important to note that, especially close now to the United States, we saw a couple of months ago how he was vital. The Erdogan regime was vital in the overthrow of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. How they have propped up the regime of the former leader of the HTS group, who's now the interim president of Syria. Complete the society over there facing a huge set of issues, especially the minorities, all because of Erdogan's large power grab. And at this point of time, the United States needs him for their machinations in West Asia. The Europeans need him because they see Erdogan as the kind of main the what do you call, the barrier to migration, because he will undertake steps that, very brutal steps that will prevent migration. There is a lot of economic production that takes place in Turkey for these Western countries. So you see the entire international community, so to speak, or the rules-based international community, completely rooting for Erdogan because he's so essential for their strategic dimensions. On the other hand, you have the people who are suffering from a massive economic crisis, which has only worsened since this arrest, who are seeing an attack on their civil liberties over the past years at People's Dispatch. There have been a number of articles about trade unions, for instance, which have been attacked continuously by the regime, journalists being attacked by the regime, so many sectors of society. And what the people are doing right now is trying to push back against the regime. The Turkish Communist Party, for instance, has taken an interesting stand where it has called its supporters, called its members to come out onto the streets in vast numbers, but also to take a look at this opportunity, this protest as an opportunity to organize more, to bring their demands and not get restricted just to the politics of the ballot, so to speak, and to actually try to set the agenda. So I think a lot of interest coming out in Turkey at this point from the people's side, and they're trying to, the last major round of protests was over a decade ago, the very iconic Occupy Gezi protests. And since then, there's been no mass round of protests in Turkey. And now what we're seeing is a very crucial moment. Erdogan most probably will survive this, but with very badly damaged legitimacy. I mean, he's really going to struggle. And I think the opposition is going to be much more emboldened. So very interesting times, I think, for the people. And it's definitely a crack and an opportunity for the people's agenda to be pushed through.
It's definitely inspiring resistance to see. Another place where we've seen very inspiring resistance is in Argentina. We covered very, very closely the presidential campaign of Javier Milei, a very far-right libertarian president, and he made in the campaign a lot of promises which have not come true. For example, dollarization, dissolving the central bank. But a lot of his promises to make massive cuts to the social programs in the country have been fulfilled on. And in his over year long presidency so far, his government has had a very severe impact on the people of Argentina, principally on the pensioners, who are in some ways one of the most vulnerable groups in society. They have been protesting basically every single Wednesday for the past several months, demanding that the government allocate more money towards public pensions. Argentina, like many countries in the global south, has had a very volatile currency due to factors which have to do with the impact of the dollar in their economy, an export economy. The loans with the IMF, the massive loan that was taken up by Mauricio Macri during his presidency in 2018. All of these factors have had a damaging effect on the Argentine economy, principally for the people whose currency has devaluated massive amounts in the span of, say, 6 years. And this means that, for example, the amount that pensioners receive is simply not enough to survive. They have been demanding that the government allocate more money for their pensions, saying that they don't have money to even buy medicine, they don't have money to buy food. And again, these are people who have been working their entire lives, paying into their pension, and now they find themselves at the end of their lives unable to eat. And so really a tragic indictment of this austerity policy, of this chainsaw economics that, Elon Musk has so artfully adopted in the United States. And the pensioners, again, have been taking this very brave and hardened stance every Wednesday, going out to Congress, protesting and demanding what's rightfully theirs. And in recent weeks, after seeing episodes of these, again, some of the most vulnerable people in society being attacked by police, different sectors of Argentine society, notably fans of football clubs decided to go out on the streets and join them, not only because it's horrifying to see an old person beaten by a police officer, but also because people recognize that, their pensions are also at stake. They may not be a pensioner today, but in a couple decades, they're also going to be facing this same challenge. And in some ways, even worse, because many people are employed in the informal sector, but that's another story. And so, as these different sectors of society, football fans, trade unions, social organizations, joined the pensioners in these protests, we saw a couple weeks back that the protests had grown in a massive size, and police violently repressed this protest. Really horrifying images again, elderly people getting pepper spray, tear gas, tanks being deployed on the streets of Buenos Aires. A really horrifying incident of a photojournalist, Pablo Grillo, who was hit in the head with a tear gas canister. He's still in the hospital, was suffering from a critical injury. So this repression really ignited, on one hand, this weekly Wednesday protest of the pensioners, but also the broader society and their resistance to Milei. And so since then, these weekly Wednesday protests have grown in size, more and more people joining as Milei continues to dole out attack after attack on the working class. So today, we're bound to see another protest of these pensioners on the streets of Buenos Aires. Last week, the protest was again brutally repressed by police, but people, that only emboldens people, as is many times in history. The repression of one sector of society often drives more and more sectors to support them. So these pensioners are not backing down. Milei, for now, is not ceding to their demands, but I think as more and more people join them in their protest, it's going to be unavoidable. This resistance is infectious, and more people are protesting the policies of this far-right government. And so this has been a really inspiring story, one that, for the past couple of weeks and months, this resistance to Milei. Another country and story which we continually come back to are the farmers in India. Prasanth, what's the latest?
Right, of course, the latest is the fact that the farmers are protesting on a number of fronts, and we see opposition actually mounting in various states on demands, or some common demands, of course, but also some very specific demands in some of these states. But overall, the trajectory that we are seeing is farmers once again stepping up their protests, intensifying their protests in response to what is, of course, the attempt by the Narendra Modi government at the center to, what has always been its agenda for many years now, which is to really privatize the sector even more, which is to bring big corporates into the sector even more. And one of the latest pipelines for this attempt is what is called the National Policy Framework on Agricultural Marketing. Now, within this looks like a very wonky term, so to speak, full of, it's all technicalities, but at its root, what it does is try to bring large corporates into the sector as much as possible, to remove state support or to reduce state support as much as possible to farmers, and that would lead to, of course, a much larger exploitation of the sector. Now, if this sounds a bit familiar, it is because over the past many years, we've heard of the story of the famous farmers, the 2021, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of farmers were on the streets around Delhi and other parts of the country, protesting against what were called the farm laws. To do the same, which is to really bring these corporate interests or to give them much more space within agriculture, and to dismantle the kind of state support, the very minimal state support that these farmers enjoy, whether it be in terms of marketing infrastructure, whether it be in terms of a minimum support price that the government uses to procure some of the crops from farmers. And this is an attempt to dismantle those farm laws. After these massive protests, the government was forced to repeal them. But ever since, farmers' unions, farmers' organizations have been warning that the government is trying to sort of bring these laws to the back door, bring these laws in other ways. And this draft policy framework is another attempt to actually do that. Many of the suggestions in this framework seem very similar to what farmers had opposed so powerfully back then. So that's one major reason they're protesting. Of course, some of the other demands also have been repeated for many years. They want the minimum support price to be, there's a specific formula for calculating the minimum support price. They want that to be implemented across the country. Right now, it is not being implemented. They want loan waivers, for instance. And hundreds and thousands of farmers have committed suicide over the past couple of decades, and there's been very little sustained action from the central government and many state governments on that. And what the farmers' unions are saying is that these simple steps, which are simple in paper, of course, but will actually have a massive impact in terms of reducing farmer suicides, in terms of giving farmers some amount of security, in terms of protecting the sector. And whereas the government, of course, is completely unwilling to listen to these demands because, one, it actually means that farmers do get that kind of security, and two, more importantly, it means that big corporate interests can't so easily muscle their way into that sector anymore, right? So that is right now the front lines of the battle. Farmers on the one hand, and these corporate interests which are supported by the government on the other. And we need to see what's happening in the coming weeks and months. On the 28th, there was a major protest that took place. Very interesting, because a lot of disparate farmers groups have actually combined together for that. And very important to note also that what is going to happen with Donald Trump's tariffs that are being proposed, because the agriculture sector might be hit massively. And if that does, that will create a new wave of opposition. So very important times ahead for India's farmers. We need to wait and watch.
Well, an inspiring story to follow as always. Now, after our stories of resistance, let's head to Ukraine, where there have been some significant developments in the last week. Roger, what's the latest?
Yeah, I mean, it's we have an expression in Britain which is about somebody what we call somebody throwing a loopy, and this is what we saw with Trump, basically, where he decided that he was going to be, as he said, he was pissed off with both Zelensky and Putin in the way that they were going about things. And he's kind of modified that in recent days, where he's now kind of targeting that mainly at Zelensky now, which is probably about right. But this kind of loopy that he threw was all on the basis that Putin said that, well, Zelensky doesn't have the kind of legitimacy to be able to negotiate because he's not a democratically elected, because he's cancelled elections. Actually, he could add a whole lot to that, in the sense that he's also banned a whole lot of opposition parties as well from being able to function as an opposition, and including the Communist Party in Ukraine. But actually, when you're trying to negotiate, I mean, I'm coming to you from a union headquarters in Britain, from Unison in the West Midlands, and one of the things that you always look for as a negotiator is somebody to legitimately negotiate with. That's a kind of reasonable thing to be able to do. And what the Russians are saying is that the Ukrainians lack legitimacy, and actually one of the reasons for that is because they've created a law. Zelensky actually created a law that said that he's not allowed to negotiate directly with the Russians. So all of that has to be sorted if you really want to be able to get to a negotiated settlement. And I don't think that's particularly unreasonable, as somebody who's been a negotiator in the past, that you have somebody who has the authority to be able to negotiate with you. So Trump threw one, well into one about all of that, but actually it's quite a reasonable position to be able to adapt, that the person in front of you has the authority to be able to negotiate. Now, part of the whole scenario that we're seeing at the moment is kind of complicated by the way that the Europeans are kind of involved in this, because they somehow think that they have some role in determining what a ceasefire agreement would look like. And frankly, and in fact, bluntly, they have no role in all of this. And the US has been really, really clear that the Europeans have no role at all in determining this. Now, this hasn't stopped the Europeans from thinking that they have, and they've had all of these kind of conferences, summits, which they call the Coalition of the Willing or whatever, which is all about really trying to say that we are going to be involved in a kind of solution for a ceasefire and hopefully to a longer term solution. And again, they have no role in this whatsoever. But in the meantime, they've created a really dangerous scenario in all of this by coming up with this idea that somehow they could have NATO troops, they could have troops who have supported Ukraine within this conflict, somehow being on the ground in some kind of peacekeeping force. Russia has been really clear about this. This is a non-runner. You cannot do this. If you do this, this is a recipe for, frankly, World War III, because we cannot allow that sort of interference in all of this. The British and the French in particular seem to still be playing with this notion that they can have troops on the ground. This is a non-runner. Russia's been clear this is a non-runner, and they are not part of the solution. So we need to, I think what's helpful in all of this is that we do seem to be moving gradually along the road to a kind of solution, to a ceasefire solution. But the point is, it's not going to involve troops on the ground from NATO. It's not going to involve any kind of troops on the ground from those forces that have supported Ukraine. But we could be moving towards eventually some kind of ceasefire. We've already seen a ceasefire on the Black Sea, which is really helpful, and it helps in terms of being able to have more grain being delivered across the world, particularly to Africa and so on. So that's all great. So the hard graft now is for those real negotiations to take place, so that Russia and the US, where the real negotiations are taking place, need to be able to sit down and come up with something. And Putin was saying earlier on this week that those discussions are continuing to take place, no matter how much Trump is saying that he's pissed off with anybody. But the kind of grown-ups are really getting on with those discussions. And Zelensky, who seems to be more about protecting his own skin, to be honest, really needs to wake up to the fact that he hasn't really got much of a say in all of this. And it's now a time to reach a solution where we can stop so many thousands of people from being killed from either side. That is the key aim now, and to reach not just a solution that reaches a temporary ceasefire, but reaches a solution where we can get to a long-term solution to all of this. But at the end of the day, Zoe, and my final point is that really at the end of the day, we've got a situation where the cards are all in Russia's favour. To be honest, they've made gains on the battleground, and they continue to make gains on the battleground. In the end, they will decide what they're prepared to do, and they will decide what sort of agreement's going to suit them, because they're the ones who have, in the end, defeated the NATO forces. That's where we are. I think it's hopeful in terms of progressing towards some kind of peace deal, but there's still a long way to go, Zoe, I think.
Well, any progress towards peace is, of course, a positive step as the world seems to barrel further and further towards a state of permanent conflict. And nowhere else is that clear than in Gaza, where now it's been over 2 weeks, I think, or over 10 days of Israel's resumption of the genocidal violence against the people of Palestine. Again, atrocious figures that we're seeing. At least over 1,000 people in Gaza have been killed in Israeli attacks since March 18th, when they resumed aerial bombing of the Gaza Strip. It seems that they're coming back even more emboldened. And yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that they were expanding their attacks and going to attempt to seize more land, almost as if they've been given a free pass by the US government to just ignore every single element of the ceasefire deal that was so carefully negotiated with so many different mediators and guarantors. That paper, that agreement seems to just have been completely thrown out the window. And it is very concerning. You're seeing images now of the funeral of many aid workers from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society who were picked off one by one by Israeli forces in Rafah when they were going on a rescue mission. I mean, the worst acts that you could commit in a war, Israel has committed them in the past 17 months, whether it's murdering children, whether it's murdering babies, whether it's murdering health workers, journalists. Every single element of this they have committed, proudly. They're the ones who are actually reporting on it, sharing those TikTok videos of them doing these atrocious acts. But despite this depravity, people across the world have resumed with full force the solidarity movement, the movement to put pressure on their governments to call for an arms embargo, the movement to call on their governments to end all aid to Israel. This has come back with full force as well, especially here in the United States, where the Trump administration has criminalized in many ways solidarity with Palestine by attempting to deport several students who were involved in the Palestine movement here on different college campuses. So there's going to be a massive march this weekend in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people expected to descend on the Capitol in another massive demonstration calling on the White House, even though it's Trump now, continuing with this message to call for an arms embargo. Biden faced a lot of pressure as president because of this movement. Trump has attempted to, attack on all fronts, to confuse, to disperse. And it seems like the movement is really coming together with this very clear message in defense of free speech. And again, calling for an end to this atrocious genocide. People across the world are so sickened and horrified that this continues with complete impunity. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to visit Hungary in the coming days. Will Hungary completely disobey the ICC arrest warrant? That remains to be seen. As of now, since the warrant was issued, Netanyahu has only visited the United States with Donald Trump. But this could also be a precedent-setting moment. Is a European leader going to completely disregard the ICC? How will Europe react to this? Will there be increased pressure? Will this ignite more resistance? Let's hope. Someone who is a wanted war criminal who has committed genocide should not be welcomed anywhere. He should be going to The Hague, where he should be tried for his war crimes. So mass protests expected this weekend. The movement continues. The genocide continues, but inspired by the example of the Palestinian people are not sitting at home and despairing. They are taking to the streets, and we've seen so many examples of this, whether it be India, whether it be London, Morocco, Johannesburg. It is truly a global movement, and it is not stopping anytime soon. So thank you all for joining us for another episode of Give the People What They Want. Don't forget to follow People's Dispatch on all social media platforms, on YouTube, where you can follow this episode. We're also releasing them on Spotify as podcasts. You can find that there as well. And tune in next week. We'll bring you more news from the world, from our movements, and the stories that you're not hearing.